Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources will come to order. Subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on energy infrastructure and its relationship to environmental justice and lessons that we've learned for building a more sustainable, clean energy future. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designees. I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. today or at the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess, subject to the call of the chair. Hearing no objection, so ordered. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at HNRC docs at mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. I hope mine is going now. As with our in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical difficulties should inform committee staff immediately. It's an undeniable fact that in our country, it is often the very wealthy and politically connected who have an outsized voice in the public decision-making process. When a privileged community decides it doesn't want something in its backyard, quite often it is the backyards of the less powerful, less connected, and less wealthy that end up bearing the burden. Fossil fuel companies know the toll that their infrastructure takes on public health and environment. They know that up front. They look to cite projects where they will face the least amount of political and public resistance, which unfortunately is often in poor, underserved, and underrepresented communities. That's why for decades, people of color and low-income communities have suffered from fossil fuel companies routing pipelines, drilling for oil and gas, siting refineries, and building power plants in their neighborhoods and near their homes. This pattern holds true for other types of fossil fuel infrastructure across the country. For example, in Pennsylvania, multiple studies of the Marcellus Shale region found there are a disproportionate number of minority and low-income residents living in areas near oil and gas wells. For too long, companies paid little public price for this decision-making, which was based on both systemic racism and unconscious bias. Just as white Americans can no longer ignore the systemic inequalities in policing, public health, and in the criminal justice system, we cannot ignore the racism that's ingrained in the systems that keep our lights on, our cars moving, our homes heated in the winter and cooled in the summer. Thanks in large part to brave activists who are willing to put their bodies on the line in order to highlight racial injustices, there has been an enormous public awakening. Two recent announcements on high-profile pipelines can be directly attributed to environmental justice activism. Over the 4th of July weekend, Dominion Energy and Duke Energy announced the cancellation of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, a 600-mile-long natural gas pipeline that had one of its permits revoked because of a lack of consideration for environmental justice issues when proposing to place a compressor station in a historical a historically Black community in Virginia, one that was founded by freed slaves. One of our witnesses today is from this community, Ella Rose, and she will share with us the threat that this pipeline posed for her community. Thank you, Ella Rose, for your years of activism. The very next day after the cancellation of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, a federal judge announced that the Dakota Access Pipeline must be completely emptied and shut down by August, while the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers completes a more thorough environmental review, which validates many of the concerns raised by the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, who faced water cannons and police violence while protesting against this pipeline in sometimes freezing temperatures. I'm proud of the work done by this committee to address environmental justice, led by our full committee chair, Chair Raul Grijalva, and our subcommittee colleague, Representative McEachin. Their work on H.R. 5886, the Environmental Justice for All Act, was recently included in the Select Committee in their comprehensive report to address the climate crisis. That legislation is designed to ensure that we don't make the same mistakes as we look forward to the infrastructure requirements of clean energy resources like wind and solar on public lands. While new wind and solar farms will reduce pollution, lower energy costs, and create new jobs, we must ensure that infrastructure planning, especially transmission, respects local input and improves environmental justice outcomes. Clean energy on public lands should be leveraged to ensure a just and equitable transition away from fossil fuels, especially for minority and tribal communities that have been the most impacted by pollution. We need to write a new playbook, one that rights historical wrongs, addresses the existential threat of climate change, and builds a more just and equitable future. I want to thank the witnesses for appearing before the committee, and I really look forward to your testimony. I now recognize Ranking Member Gosar for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal, and thanks to the witnesses for taking the time to join us today to discuss planning for energy infrastructure. I would like to first note my disappointment in the recent cancellation of the proposed Atlantic Coast Pipeline. The project sponsors cited the risk and uncertainty associated with ongoing litigation as a primary reason for canceling the project. The ACP proposed to transport cheap, clean-burning, American-produced natural gas across West Virginia, and North Carolina, creating approximately 17,000 well-paying jobs, union jobs, and $2.7 billion worth of economic activity in the process. The project was also expected to generate about $4.2 million in local tax revenue every year to the communities along the pipeline route. One such community is Union Hill, Virginia, in Buckingham County. The pipeline proposed called for a location of a compressor station in this county, as a pipeline would need to connect to the existing Transco pipeline, which runs through that county. The project sponsors worked with the local community to create the Greater Union Hill Development Corporation and offered the organization $5 million to put towards projects for the betterment of the Union Hills community. Some of these projects included new recreational facilities, a new health clinic, job training for the project at the local community college, and a fully funded year-round fire station, as the town of Union Hill had recently lost theirs due to the lack of funding. Project sponsors had committed to hiring at least 25% of the workforce from the local community in a county with 10% unemployment. This project would have also allowed local manufacturing facilities to switch from diesel to natural gas to power their operations. 5 local pastors recognized the potential of this project to improve life in their community and signed this letter of support for the ACP. They noted that once the project sponsors made an effort to engage with the community, they gained a better understanding of the residents and their needs and made a financial commitment to community development projects. And I would like to submit that for the record. Did you get that, Alan? Submit that for the record.
Action.
Okay. My colleagues have responded to the cancellation of this project with glee and are here today to take a victory lap, celebrating the loss of 17,000 union new jobs that disappeared the instant ACP was canceled. They claim that we will make up for these missed opportunities for job creation with cleaner burning energy with a massive scale up in renewable projects someday. If these projects can overcome NEPA, if they can find funding, if they can clear the NIMBYism that threatens to stop every major project. In the meantime, my colleagues sign on to the pie in the sky proposals like the Green New Deal and pass bill after bill through this committee designed to kill conventional energy development. The so-called Unity Task Force, made up of staffers from the Biden, Sanders camps, and Representative Ocasio-Cortez, have naively called to end carbon-based electricity generation by 2035 and net zero emissions in the US by 2050. At the same time, my colleagues block Republicans' attempts to fast track renewable energy developments on public lands. They refuse to mark up Representative Fulcher's bill to promote geothermal energy because it would speed up geothermal exploration through the use of a categorical exclusion. The majority included my bill in the Public Lands Renewable Energy Act in their partisan highway bill early this month, but strangely left out language that would have included the Forest Service lands in targeted planning for renewable energy development. How sad. If we're going to take smart planning for renewable energy on public lands seriously, I encourage my colleagues to work with us in two critical areas. First, NEPA reform and securing our end to endless litigation under NEPA. We must engage in meaningful NEPA reform if we ever wish to see a significant increase in renewable generation and transmission on federal lands. Further, we must acknowledge that increased demand for renewable energy will drive up the demand for critical minerals, which are integral to these technologies. Cobalt, for example, is required for electrical vehicles, satellites, wind turbines to function. 60% of the global cobalt supply is mined in the Congo, where abhorrent child labor practices are well documented, and China now controls at least half of all the cobalt production in that country. Fortunately, the proposed twin metal mines in Minnesota would serve as a rare source of domestic cobalt, but of course my colleagues aim to shut that project down as well, passing language to do so through Appropriations Committee just last week. Our inaction on critical minerals has consequences. We have sat idly while China has gained almost full global control over dozens of important minerals, putting our medical, manufacturing, technology, and energy supply chains at their mercy. The American people experienced the consequences of their over-reliance on China firsthand in recent months, and I think we all agree that the status quo is unacceptable. If we choose not to engage on these two critical topics, NEPA reform and domestic mining investment, a vibrant U.S. economy powered by significant renewable energy generation will remain just that, a fantasy. Delaying the development of new natural gas pipelines only increases our reliance on foreign oil and gas while American jobs hang in the balance. The American people are tired of the delays caused by endless litigation, delayed jobs, delayed investment in their communities, and delayed economic certainty that feels like it will never come. It's time for us to stop delaying, stop letting litigation and regulation prevent us from modernizing our infrastructure and start building. With that, Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Gosar, for your opening statement. Now I will introduce today's witnesses. Ms. Jacqueline Patterson is the Senior Director of the Environmental and Climate Justice Program at the NAACP. Ella Rose is a resident of Union Hill, Virginia, and worked for many years as an activist against the now canceled Atlantic Coast Pipeline. Julia Prochnick is the founder of JAS Energies, a consulting firm which specializes in renewable energy transmission. And finally, we have Sarah Obed, the Senior Vice President of External Affairs at Doyen Limited, an Alaskan Native regional corporation. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will begin and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining. I recommend that members and witnesses jointly use the quotes grid view of the timer so that they may pin the timer onto their screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I will also allow the entire panel to testify before questioning the witnesses. The chair now recognizes Ms. Patterson to testify.
Thank you so much. Hopefully you can hear me. Yes. Okay, good. So if he were here today, 10-year-old Thomas of Jacksonville, Florida, could share his part of the story of the complex relationship between our energy infrastructure and the health and well-being of Black communities. Thomas lives just 2 miles from a coal-fired power plant. He has severe asthma and has to stay home from school on poor air quality days. When Thomas stays home, his parents, who don't have paid sick leave, miss income, while Thomas loses critical ground in his educational advancement. Mr. Hartwell of Charlestown, West Virginia, is a coal miner who is in a profession where 76,000 of his workers have lost their lives to Black lung disease. Yet he feels trapped in the only job he has ever known, one that puts food on his family's table, provides health care, and guarantees a pension. When Grandma Maisie of St. Louis, Missouri was asked about whether she would be in favor of a hike in her electricity bill to finance investment in energy efficiency, she responded that she would gladly pay more if it meant that she didn't have to take her grandbaby to the emergency room for his asthma attacks driven by pollution from power plants. Ms. Eglund of Gulfport, Mississippi says there has to be a better way than her $400 per month summer energy bills. She and her husband are on a fixed income as retirees in a state with such high energy burden that some people pay upwards of 30% of their incomes on electricity. These aren't just one-off examples. Each of these is an illustrative indicator of a widespread pattern of systemic energy injustice. In our cold-blooded reports and fumes across the fence line reports, we describe how Black communities are more likely to live in the shadows of coal plants and oil and gas refineries. These fossil fuel facilities pollute our communities with mercury, arsenic, lead, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, methane, and benzene, toxins that are tied to respiratory, digestive, and circulatory illnesses, cognitive and behavioral challenges, and endocrine disruption. Impacts include cancer clusters, poor birth outcomes, adults who are less likely to smoke but more likely to die of lung disease, and children who are 2 to 3 times more likely to die of an asthma attack. Through our partners, we've heard of missing and murdered Indigenous women around the pipelines and man camps of the oil and gas industry in South Dakota and beyond. In our reports, Lights Out in the Cold, Reforming Utility Shutoff Policies as If Human Rights Matter, we chronicle families who paid the price of poverty with their very lives, where they were burning down their homes using candles or space heaters, or dying in their sleep from carbon monoxide poisoning from bringing a generator inside for safekeeping, or the multiple examples of respirator-dependent people who had their electricity cut off over a $60 energy bill. In our report, The 10 Equity Implications of the COVID-19 Pandemic, we spoke of how the situation has severely exacerbated energy insecurity, as well as how, according to Harvard University, pollution from energy production creates particulate matter that has been tied to our differential COVID-19 susceptibility and mortality. In our In the Eye of the Storm toolkit, we detail impacts of the excessive greenhouse gas emissions that have us in the crosshairs of catastrophic climate change, which also disproportionately impacts our communities. In our fossil fueled foolery report, we detail how profits from pollution are invested in anti-clean air and anti-clean energy lobbying to maintain a status quo that is a death sentence for too many of our communities. But it doesn't have to be that way. Robert Wallace of Bith Group Technologies, a multi-million-dollar tech company in Baltimore. Jahan Giron, formerly of the Black Mesa Water Coalition, which owns its own energy infrastructure in Flagstaff. NAACP leader Rosemary Harris Lytle in Colorado Springs, who started the Power Up Employment Project to train formerly incarcerated persons in solar installations. Denise Fairchild of Emerald Cities Collaborative paved a pathway for high road careers in renewable energy. All of these leaders and more have seen the promised land. In our Just Energy Policies report, Power to the People Toolkit, and Unleashing the Power of the People reports, we lift up the movement building work of NAACP leaders in Oregon, Maryland, Indiana, Mississippi, Illinois, and beyond, as well as partners, Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, Solidarity, Co-op Power, People Solar Energy Fund, and the Local Clean Energy Alliance, Native Renewables, and so many more. We have not only seen what's possible, but we've been inspired by what's already happening, and our only task is to scale up. In closing, if we believe that Black Lives Matter, if we deeply value taking the knee of white supremacy off the neck of Black America, if we sincerely want to end inhumane practices of sacrifice zones poisoning entire communities, if we truly want to legislate upholding human and earth rights, we must dismantle a utility business model that withholds life-saving heating, cooling, or electricity for a respirator from impoverished households while filling the coffers of utility CEOs to the tune of an average $9.8 million in annual compensation. We must advance a radical transformation, a just transition to a new economy. We must have a system that puts power in the hands of the people, literally and figuratively. Thank you.
And I want to thank you, Ms. Patterson. The chair now recognizes Ms. Rhodes. Ms. Rose, welcome to the committee, Ms. Rose. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. My name is Ella Rose, and I was born and raised in Nelson County, Virginia. I retired to Buckingham County, a neighboring county, about 8 years ago. I learned about the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and the associated compressor station in 2014. A neighbor invited me to a church meeting where a newly organized group, Friends of Buckingham, were conducting a meeting to share information and concerns and to learn more about what this would mean for our neighborhood. The more I learned and the more I realized that I had to protect my home and community. This was especially so when I learned that the location of the compressor station, a very large, noisy, polluting infrastructure, was on the land only 150 feet from my front door. There were originally 3 considerations for the placement of the compressor station. Dominion Energy decided to place it in our 84% African American neighborhood of Union Hill. Opposing the pipeline and the compressor station became a full-time job for me as I became more and more active. This was not the plan I had for my retirement. I had spent much of my life working in cities, and they were noisy and chaotic. This home that I had just moved to 2 years before had taken many years to pay for was the peace and quiet that I had always hoped for. I enjoy the wildlife nearby, including looking out of my window to see deer, turkey, and occasionally a bear. These are simple pleasures, and it is very important to me to be able to enjoy them. Although it was not something that I was used to doing, I began to speak at public hearings. It started with the local ones, which were necessary for Dominion Energy to obtain for the county, such as a special use permit, as the rural area of Union Hill was zoned for agriculture. I also spoke at the FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission hearing, and later at multiple hearings with the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. Despite my effort to make my voice heard, I felt largely ignored by the local government, FERC, and Virginia DAQ. No one from the federal government had come to talk to the community about this project, and Dominion acted like the pipes were already in the ground. The Department of Environmental Quality finally came 4 years later at the invitation of Friends of Buckingham. And only after we had raised the public awareness of the location in our low income and African American neighborhood. The attitude from Dominion that the project was inevitably going to happen and we needed to accept it. This is what divided the community. Many who had not been coming to our meeting weren't informed, as some of us in the neighborhood, in the community, decided to take that deal Dominion was offering, such as a community center. Many of us who were on the other side of this were not invited to those meetings. So deals were struck based on the compressor station being built. I was not included in any of those negotiation, nor was the Friends of Buckingham, where I was now a council member. My concern about the compressor station were multiple. I was very concerned about the air quality, as I was so close. I would have been forced to breathe emissions on a daily 24/7 basis for the rest of my life in this location. I was deeply concerned that I would develop respiratory problems or other medical conditions as a result of these emissions. My sister-in-law, who lives across the road, already had respiratory problems, as do many others in our community. I was aware that there would be blowdowns when a large amount of emission would be blown into the air. When Dominion first started talking about these blowdowns during the local meeting with our Board of Supervisors, they said they will only occur every few years. Over time, the information changed, but at last count being multiple times per week. It seemed that we were getting a lot of misinformation. This did not increase my trust in them. I was also concerned about the constant noise and what it would do to my stress level. I was additionally afraid of what a pipeline with all the digging, trenching would do to my shallow well, my only source of drinking water, which was the same for many other community members. I was also troubled by the reason why my neighborhood was selected for the location of the compressor station. My neighborhood is predominantly African American. It is 84% African American, settled after emancipation by the enslaved freedmen people who worked the plantations in the area. The environmental impact studies never indicated this. It is one of the reasons I believe we won in the Fourth Circuit Court. DEQ did not take into consideration who lived there and the disproportionate impact on us. I believe that they picked this location and not the other two they had identified because they did not think we would speak up. Our lives count, and we should not be a sacrifice zone for financial interests. Thank you for this opportunity to speak about my experiences.
Thank you, Ms. Rhodes. As members of this committee know, I do not strictly adhere to the limits. I would like members and also panelists to try to keep their remarks to the 5 minutes. But if you go slightly over, I will not penalize you and allow both Republicans and Democratic members to do that and stay up. Now, I would like to recognize Ms. Prochnick to testify. Ms. Prochnick, you have 5 minutes for testimony, or slightly more.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you very clearly.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal and members of the committee. It is an honor to be here with all of you and my fellow panelists to testify today. I stand in solidarity with the Black communities deeply harmed by our social injustices and inequalities. As a mother with young children, I am committed to a clean energy future, an inclusive economy for the benefit of all, and a just and equitable society. It cannot come to pass without acknowledging and overcoming insidious discrimination. As we become increasingly dependent on electricity, the United States needs to modernize the grid, expanding capacity and improving reliability for a strong, prosperous future. Clean energy will help us achieve this task and recover from the current COVID-19 recession. But we must act and think differently to ensure diverse stakeholders, including disadvantaged and frontline communities, Black and Brown organizations, are at the table, participating in and benefiting from each step towards a brighter future. I will cover challenges and opportunities facing the electric grid in two themes: inequities of the grid and inclusive planning. The electric grid is the economic backbone of our country. As with every other aspect of the nation, it needs greater inclusivity and equality. In the last 9 years, US power companies announced their retirement of more than 546 coal-fired power units, most of which are located in frontline or disadvantaged communities or on tribal lands. Another 17 gigawatts, about 3 times what Washington, D.C. uses, of coal-fired capacity will retire by 2025. In April 2019, renewable energy overtook coal for the first time in the US, providing 23% of our power, compared to coal's 20%. Historically, planning has sidestepped social and climate justice concerns. As grid generation changes, transmission changes too. Public policies promoting 100% clean energy and carbon reduction seek economic stimulus and market and regulatory certainty. Community transition is not always at the top of the list and must be part of the plan. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. To change the inequities in planning, a community benefits framework is recommended as an integrated approach that simultaneously considers the demand and supply network, as well as the land footprint and the system as a whole. Expanding access to data and information will help decrease the pressure on frontline and disadvantaged communities who are continually exploited by fossil fuels. Attention must be paid to the unique characteristics of rural and indigenous communities. When siting transmission lines and renewable energy, it is essential to have inclusive policy discussions to discuss options and involve communities in decisions on how best to reduce land and community impacts. Reliability standards also need innovation. Transmission rights-of-ways are networked on many federal public lands where vegetation management is necessary to maintain reliability. Tree contacts have caused many wildfires and blackouts in the US and around the world. Pathways and benefits of integrated vegetation management can be balanced, however. An inclusive cost-benefit analysis of land factors and conservation can provide a better understanding of grid hardening. When transmission cannot be upgraded or built, non-wire solutions can assist grid reliability. Federal and state policies provide for consideration of non-transmission alternatives like rooftop solar, storage, conservation, and energy efficiency, and local and regional transmission planning processes. One tool to bridge inequities in planning is to incorporate inclusive SMART from the start, which enables utilities and developers to engage affected communities early in the process and discuss potential issues with possible construction sites and consider multiple alternatives. The existing NEPA process using SMART from the start planning should be strengthened to be more inclusive and expand opportunities for public involvement in the federal decision-making process. Inclusion means impacted communities are treated as equal partners and their interests are protected equally. Congress, agencies, legislators can streamline and clarify the text of laws to make requirements more understandable, reduce paperwork burdens, and have multiple agencies that administer similar requirements jointly approve projects. Federal agencies need to increase public comment periods, conduct various types of public hearings for greater accessibility, and translate information about proposed projects. The initial West-wide energy corridors, Section 368 Interagency Plan, did not incorporate SMART from the start. It was a first of its kind report and a good start, but the federal government has to play an inclusive role ensuring environmental justice principles are addressed to close the climate gaps when developing clean energy infrastructure projects on public lands. I offer these recommendations for key changes for the grid. Keep the just and equitable transition in mind for all types of planning. Create access to capacity data, planning tools, and new models. Coordinate inclusive state and regional and interregional planning. Improve federal resource planning and coordination. In order to provide a more equitable and inclusive transmission system on public lands, Congress needs to, 1, direct the Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Department of Energy to publish the final West-wide Energy Corridor Plan and begin a new wind and solar programmatic inclusive study. 2, direct all federal agencies to implement tribal and environmental justice policies and include them in holistic planning. 3, direct all federal land agencies to create criteria protecting tribal, low-income, frontline, and disadvantaged communities from green gentrification. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions and working together to solve the inequities of the grid.
Thank you, Ms. Prochnick. The chair now recognizes Ms. Obed for testimony. Welcome.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Welcome to the committee, Ms. Obed. You need to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal. Thank you, Ranking Member Gosar and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on considerations regarding environmental justice in the context of American energy infrastructure needs. My name is Sarah Obed. I'm a Sebastian from Minto, Alaska, which is approximately 130 miles northwest of Fairbanks, right in the heart of Alaska. I serve as the Senior VP of External Affairs for Golan Limited. Golan was established under the Alaska Native Settlement Act in 1971. We're based in Fairbanks, and we have more than 20,000 Alaska Native shareholders. We're the largest private landowner in Alaska with a land entitlement under INCA of more than 12.5 million acres. Our mission is to promote the economic and social well-being of our shareholders and our future shareholders, to strengthen our native way of life and to protect and enhance our land resources. We operate a diverse family of companies and industries, including oil and gas service, contracting, natural resource development, government contracting and tourism, utilities, and telecommunications. We are also pursuing several mineral and oil and gas exploration projects in interior Alaska. If successful, these projects will provide substantial benefits to Golan and our shareholders. Responsible development of our energy and natural resources is of significant importance to Golan and to our shareholders. Our success as an Alaska Native corporation demands that our investments in energy infrastructure and development be done with consideration for the needs of our people and the health of the land and water that has always supported our community. The revenues, jobs, and economic activities from oil exploration and development are important to the present and future well-being of all Alaskans, including Native people and our village and regional corporations. Services and contracts associated with oil exploration and development are key source of jobs and revenue for Golan and many others throughout the state. At the same time, our lands and resources thereon are critically important for customary and traditional subsistence of fish and wildlife. Our mission requires that we honor all of these interests, pursuing responsible economic development, while at the same time protecting and enhancing our socioeconomic welfare, our culture, and our lands and resources. When Congress in the late 1960s debated the merits of establishing corporations as the mechanism for serving Aboriginal land claims in Alaska, members spoke to the merits of empowering Alaska Native people to own our own natural resources in Alaska. Our lands were selected by us for our use. Many of our lands, which were first selected near our home villages, are intended for traditional activities such as hunting and fishing. Many of their lands were selected intentionally for their oil and gas potential or their mineral potential. For Doyon, environmental justice includes a focus on celebrating our way of life that has existed since time immemorial. It's also an opportunity for Doyon to ensure socioeconomic benefits to our people. This includes cash benefits, jobs, wages, and educational scholarships. The Alaska oil and gas industry is important to Doyon. We have built a healthy and sustainable business that employs hundreds of our Alaska Native shareholders and provides career opportunities. The economic impact of Doyon, together with other local Alaska Native organizations, including corporations and tribes, hit $1.05 billion in 2016. Last year, we employed 916 employees, of which 316 were Doyon shareholders. We also contributed last year $2.4 million to tribes, schools, nonprofits, and our affiliated education foundation, the Doyon Foundation. This included $200,000, which is an annual contribution meant to rejuvenate and support Indigenous languages of our region. We also distributed $26 million in cash to our shareholders through the Doyon Settlement Trust. In addition to ensuring these benefits are shared with our people, we also recognize that we are engaged in project development. We recognize the critical importance of meaningful outreach and engagement with Alaska Native people, as our people have socioeconomic and cultural interests in proposed development. This is outreach that we strive to do well at within our region. So thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'll be pleased to answer any questions from members of the subcommittee.
Thank you, Ms. Obed. Thank you for being the witness that try to keep it within 5 minutes also. I appreciate that. I thank the panel, all the panel, for your testimony. I want to remind members now that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit. I'm going to let you also go over by a little bit, but try to keep it within as close to 5 minutes as possible. And I'm going to recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. I'm going to recognize Representative Levin for the first 5 minutes. Welcome, Representative.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Great to see you. Good to see my colleagues, and want to thank you for holding today's hearing. And I really want to thank the witnesses both for their activism and for their testimony. I wanted to start with a question for Ms. Patterson. From what I've read, the African-American community not only suffers from higher rates of pollution from fossil fuel infrastructure, but on average, they also pay higher home energy bills than white people. Ms. Patterson, what is the better option, in your view, for addressing these inequities? Expanding use of fossil fuels or investing in clean energy and energy efficiency?
Thank you so much. I appreciate the question, Representative Levin. So, yeah, so for us, because of all of the other challenges around pollution from fossil fuel-based energy production, we definitely find that increasing investments in energy efficiency and clean energy is better for the well-being of our communities, both because of investing in energy efficiency reducing the amount of energy that needs to be produced in the first place, as well as reducing the bills that folks have to pay, and investing in clean energy removes the burden of pollution that we have in our communities, and also offers opportunity for ownership of the energy infrastructure, which also increases financial security. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ms. Patterson. Ms. Prochnick, do you agree with that? And do you think that clean energy offers the best way to reduce electricity bills for low-income people?
Thank you, Representative Levin. And yes, I do agree with Jackie. I think she makes valid points that need to be heard and recognized. All of her points that she raised about, acknowledging what needs to be done in low-income and disadvantaged communities, starting with energy efficiency, conservation, and helping fund a lot of the initiatives is very beneficial.
And expanding on that, what role does transmission play in that effort? And could more efficient transmission planning and integration with renewables help lower household electricity bills as well?
Yes, thank you again for the question. Transmission does play a role. It brings a lot of access to renewable energy that is on public lands across the country. And so transmission lines help bring inexpensive solar and wind to urban centers. And it's a great way to bring resources from different communities together. It also provides a great way for reliability and really making use of our existing right-of-way system and our transmission lines.
And I wanted to ask you also, Ms. Prochnick, about your time at the Department of Energy. I think you worked on the Section 368 West-wide energy corridors. Could you describe what worked and what didn't work with that project, and how updated corridors will help our transition away from fossil fuels and towards a clean energy future?
Thank you for the question. I did work at Department of Energy, enjoyed my time there, learned a lot. And I think bringing together agencies, bureaus, and offices who had never really worked together before and had competing interests was a challenge. But we worked through the various expectations and found a common purpose. We still miss sections that if we would have been more inclusive, we would have produced a much better product. The updated report, which I look forward to reading, should be built on inclusive smart from the start planning, and really has a more inclusive component for environmental justice, frontline and tribal interests. I hope they've also looked at the expanding need for new corridors in appropriate locations to access areas with high renewable energy potential and low conflict renewable energy zones.
Thank you for that. What are the benefits to developers of working inside these designated corridors, and what are the environmental benefits?
There are many benefits to working inside these corridors because you have had the agencies work together and coordinate and streamline criteria. There could be a lot more benefits of more dialogue and discussion and more opportunity for public comment. It does help the process in time that since you are coordinating, you can decrease the long lead time to build transmission. But I think there needs to be more on inclusivity.
Well, thank you, Ms. Prochnick. And your work at DOE reminds me of the Public Land Renewable Energy Development Act, a bill that I've introduced with Ranking Member Gosar. Our bill provides a smart from the start planning framework for renewable energy generation on our public lands. And that's better for developers and better for consumers, and ultimately will help facilitate more renewable energy projects. I'm very pleased that our committee unanimously approved the bill, and I hope it'll be considered soon on the House floor. And Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Levin. I now recognize Ranking Member Gosar for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman, and my friend from California. It would have been nice to see in the infrastructure bill, our full bill placed in there, not excluding Forest Service, because we're stewards of the federal inventory, and we need to have everything on the table. And I think Ms. Plachek would actually agree on that. My question is for Ms. Obed. Can you tell, is it a one size fits all that we can't have our cake and eat it too? Isn't there a way that we can actually have energy production and still protect the environment, as particularly a Native American? You're one with nature. Tell us that your aspects of having it both ways.
Thank you, Ranking Member Gosar. I would agree that Oil and gas development will continue to be part of going on business models in the as we move forward into the future. We do support a, as you mentioned, it's not a one size fits all type of deal. You have to look at what fits each community and take those things into consideration as we go forward and develop. Here in Fairbanks, I burn diesel at my house, and if we move out to more rural areas into rural Alaska, they're burning diesel. And until it's economically feasible to do more of the renewable pieces, renewable energy income, I don't really see us transitioning very quickly to a lot of renewable resources until we have a plan with those communities on how to transition. In the meantime, it's not very feasible to say we're going to transition 100% off oil.
So, I mean, that brings me to my point. The weakest link in renewable energy is batteries, is baseload power. We got tons of power during the 11 to 6 o'clock period of time, and we have no place to actually put it. So the batteries are actually problematic because they're the weak link in here. Now that's going to require a lot of critical minerals. How do you see that playing out within your Alaska domain?
So as I mentioned, we do have growing mineral resource exploration opportunities on ground land. We have 12.5 million acres of land. Some of them were definitely selected for mineral resource development. And what we've seen is the push for renewable energy drive increased investment in mineral extraction. So people are looking for gold and copper on land. And so it's definitely the transition has benefited going on either way. So if you're looking for green energy, it's driving interest and investment in mineral resource extraction.
So now I want you to tell us a little bit about the corporation setup, because the tribes are in charge of their resources, are they not? And they bid it out. So can you tell us a little bit about that you're empowered by overseeing the natural resources and how that parlays into shared revenues?
Sure, I'll do my best. There are Alaska Native tribes in Alaska, and there's Alaska Native corporations. And I am a tribal member, and I am a shareholder member. As going on is the Alaska Native Regional Corporation, and one of the things that's required of the 12 regional corporations is revenue sharing. So if there's mineral resource development on Alaska Native land, from timber, oil and gas, or mineral, there's a requirement that you share 70% of the profits earned from those natural resources across the state. So if there's development of resources on Boyan land, Boyan would be responsible for sharing those revenues with other Alaska corporations who are in the state, both regional and those corporations.
So I want to get back to renewable energy. So right now in Alaska, you have lots of daylight, right? Very little dark. But in the wintertime, you have lots of dark, very little sunlight. So that makes it very problematic when you're not looking at natural resources or things like solar and wind. However, like geothermal could also be an opportunity. But that's part of the problem, is it not?
I think it's due in large part on how many people live in each community and what resources are close by. So geothermal is only available in microgrids in very specific areas, and don't benefit a large number of people across a large geographic area. Similarly, we have solar panels on our roof, and I think the technology there is growing every day, but I think it's a very modest impact to our building. And it works more in the summer than in the winter, but really in the winter, what you really need is space heat, focus on space heat. And that is really a mixed bag in terms of what kind of energy you're using, what kind of energy source you're using to provide safety and electricity for your community, whether it be the building or the community.
Ms. Obed, thank you so very much. Thanks for your time. Wish I was in
Thank you.
Alaska. Talk to you soon.
Judy is welcome to visit.
Well, thank you both for those questions. I now recognize Representative DeGette for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I love Alaska too, but I'm glad to be in Colorado right now. And I do have to say, as what appears to me to be the only female member of Congress on this hearing, I'm really proud of the fact that every single one of our witnesses talking about environmental justice is a woman. And for you guys, you know, this doesn't happen for me very often. So every one of you was a powerful, powerful witness talking about how important these issues are to the health of our families and future generations. And I want to thank you. Ms. Patterson, we saw you last month at the Energy and Commerce Committee meeting. So welcome back. Glad to see you again. And Ms. Rose, I want to tell you, your story was so powerful to me because I represent Denver, Colorado, and we have a lot of environmental justice areas in my district. In particular, we have an area up in the northern part of my district that's right adjacent to some industrial areas, Swansea, Elyria, and Globeville. And the residents who live in these areas, they tend to be communities of color, lower income neighborhoods, but very solid historic communities of home ownership, people who have lived there for a long time and who have been subjected for many generations to environmental degradation in their areas. And of course, their kids have health problems. There's an increase in asthma. All the things that you talked about today in your testimony, we're seeing in these communities in my district. And so I want to ask a little bit to some of the witnesses about this. And I want to start with you, Ms. Patterson. When you hear something, let me just back up for a minute, is one of the issues I've been focusing on lately, right near my district, is there's a Suncor refinery. There's a refinery right near these neighborhoods. And Ms. Patterson, when you hear about something like a refinery located right next to a minority or low income community, does that set off any alarm bells for you?
Yes, thank you. As we detailed in our Fumes Across the Fence Line report from reviewing multiple communities that are on the fence lines of these oil and gas refineries, we have found, along with our work with groups like Physicians for Social Responsibility, the National Medical Association, the Clean Air Task Force, so that the health impacts of being on the fence lines of these facilities are extremely detrimental. There's a pattern of cancer clusters, other types of illnesses, or asthma clusters and so forth that are causing morbidity and mortality for our communities.
And you know, that's what we've seen as well. And then just to add, the Suncor plant has a huge pattern of air quality violations, and the standard that they had were a standard that the state of Colorado let them set. So they were complying with their own standard that they set. And what the standard was for was hydrogen cyanide. And so I actually introduced federal legislation to set a federal standard that people would have to comply with. And I guess I just want to ask you, how important is real-time monitoring and reporting of pollution if there's an energy infrastructure right next to these neighborhoods, these really vulnerable neighborhoods?
Yeah, extremely important, because for one thing, you have different times when there is escalation of emissions. So we really need to know at all times when what's happening with these plants. So whether it's flaring or peaker plants that are operating and sometimes and not others, go on.
And we have to look at the cumulative impacts as well, right? Of all sources of pollution.
Yes.
So recently, I introduced the Clean Energy Innovation and Deployment Act to drive the deployment of clean energy and to also provide assistance to low-income households and help energy workers in communities. I'm wondering, Ms. Prochnick, if you can tell us why it's important to consider environmental justice and environmental justice communities when we're looking at the transition to a clean energy economy.
It's critical. I think the clean energy, and thank you for the question. I think the clean energy industry should start with 3 steps: acknowledging and incorporating environmental justice principles and the fact that racism exists and work to change this. Conduct inclusive policy discussions and change the process and decision-making to be more inclusive. And provide needed data to all decision makers so they can make informed choices in planning, standard development, and compliance.
Thank you. I just have one last question. Ms. Patterson, is climate change and environmental justice issue?
Absolutely, because we see across the continuum where communities of color, frontline communities are most impacted, from the pollutants that cause climate change to the impacts of climate change, whether it's shifts in agricultural yields, sea level rise, or disasters. We see how communities, vulnerable communities, politically and economically disenfranchised communities are deeply impacted disproportionately.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, thank you for having this important hearing. It's really important and I appreciate it. I yield back.
Thank you. And I now recognize Representative Westerman for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and greetings from the front lines of Washington, D.C., where I believe congressional business should take place. There's been a lot of talk about social and environmental justice in this hearing today, 2 things I think we're all concerned about. And it reminded me of an article that I read a few years ago that Peggy Noonan wrote in the Wall Street Journal, where she talked about 2 classes of people in this country. She talked about the protected and the unprotected. And in her words, she said, the protected are those who make the rules. The unprotected live with those rules. She said, the protected are the accomplished, the secure, the successful, those who have power or access to it. They are protected from much of the roughness of the world. More to the point, they are protected from the world they have created. Again, they make public policy and have for some time. In March of this year, Peggy Noonan did a follow-up to that article, and within 1 day of that, a writer for the New York Times, Brett Stevenson, he quoted that article, and he talked about not the protected and the unprotected, but the remote and the exposed. And I think that's what we're talking about here today, are those people who are on the front lines and those people who are able to work from their basements or their homes, who don't have to get out to make a living. And I wanted to ask Ms. Obed this question. If some of these heavy-handed policies proposed by the left were implemented, what would happen to the hardworking men and women of the Dorian Regional Corporation who are on the front lines every day so we can do our jobs remotely by WebEx from the safety of our homes?
Well, thank you, Representative Westman, for the question. I think going on as a Alaska Native corporation makes decisions based on the long term. We don't have quarterly reports as an Alaska Native corporation, as our shareholders can't buy and sell their stock. It's all inherited. And so we make long-term decisions, and we really aim to hire our Alaska Native shareholders. I actually started at going on as an intern about 10 years ago, and going on has supported me.
Ms. Obed, if I can interrupt, it's inaudible. If you could answer that and submit it to the record. I think it's just a poor connection. That's one of the problems of doing these types of hearings. I'm going to move on. And talking about the this Atlantic Coast pipeline and looking at it in the light of environmental justice and social justice, let's look at it environmentally. This pipeline was going to be carrying clean, domestically produced U.S. natural gas. If you look at the biggest advocacy group for the Appalachian Trail, I would say that's the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. And in an article, an NPR article in February 2020 that I'd like to submit for the record, it called "The Supreme Court Pipeline Fight Could Disrupt How the Appalachian Trail is Run." The Appalachian Trail Conservancy said that they do not oppose the pipeline. The group warns that a ruling could upend the complicated structure that allows them to maintain the trail. The Appalachian Trail is being used as a tool to stop it. That was a quote by the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. The Conservancy said they saw complications from the case as the Forest Service asked them to halt maintenance due to ongoing litigation. Let's look at it from a social justice standpoint. There were going to be 17,000 well-paying union jobs that were lost because this pipeline was stopped. Potential benefits of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline to Union Hill was that the project sponsors created a local development corporation and have prepared to offer $5 million for projects like a fire station, a health clinic, recreational facilities, job training for local residents to work on the pipeline. There's currently 10% unemployment in the area. The project sponsors were offering well-paying union jobs during a pandemic. Local manufacturing facilities have been able to switch from diesel to natural gas, which would improve the environment. And the list goes on both the social and environmental justice benefits of this project. And as the left is taking a victory lap on this project cancellation, I have a question. I guess I could open it to the whole panel, but I want to start with Ms. Prochnick. Given the documented environmental, social, and economic benefits of the pipeline, are you celebrating a victory for the protected or the unprotected and exposed who deserve justice, or the remote and protected like yourself who got their way on this project?
Thank you, Representative, for the question. I do think that natural gas is a fossil fuel. And I do think that we need to transition to a clean energy economy.
Okay, I'm going to stop right there just a second. So you can put this in a written statement because you probably don't have time to answer it, but please explain to me how, and I'm a big supporter of renewable energy. How do you have renewable energy without coal, natural gas, or nuclear power? Now you can carry on.
I would love to provide a written statement too with a lot more data and background, but I'll point out that it can be done. You know, renewable energy in the past.
I'm an engineer and I would love to see that. I would
Great.
love to read that data.
Okay.
Since renewables are less than 10% of the mix right now.
Actually,
They
it's
have
23%. And they're very reliable. In the last 5 years, we realized that renewables provide ancillary services to keep the lights on. And when you combine long duration and short duration storage with renewable energy, you can get to 100% clean goal. And the grid will work because we have operators.
If you had the storage, which we don't.
And wind and solar and geothermal and hydro. And we do. Our nation has wonderful natural resources that are clean that we can use.
Yeah. So I'm way over time, Mr. Chairman, so I'll let you decide whether you want to let others answer or move on.
You each have a very short answer if you want to ask others, but you are well over. Does anyone else on the panel want to answer that question?
I would just point in terms of data to the work that comes out of Stanford. I think it's Dr. Mark Jacobson on some of the scenarios for how we can actually achieve 100% renewable, given the technology at hand and the technology that's in the pipeline, so to speak. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to let the other panelists answer in a written form because we're going over it. And I'm going to move forward to Representative Huffman. Representative, you have 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Lowenthal. And just following on my colleague Bruce Westerman's interesting questions just now, I'm coming to you from Northern California, where the lights are actually on in my house. And it's an amazing thing because that's happening with 100% clean energy. Here in Marin County, we have a community choice aggregator, Marin Clean Energy. And amazingly, they're able to generate electrons using 100% clean renewable energy for me and for much of Northern California. So there's really no mystery to it. And I know the COVID-19 crisis has canceled a lot of our plans. I had hoped to have Mr. Westerman out to my district for a district exchange as part of the Bipartisan Policy Institute. I now know to include more than just forestry in that visit. I want to show him how we actually have a modern clean energy grid, and we can do this. So appreciate that question. But Mr. Chairman, to the point of this hearing, I think we have a series of recent decisions involving pipelines that highlight the reality that impacts on local communities as well as basic economics are contributing to the movement away from these dirty, destructive fossil fuels and away from unnecessary and dangerous pipelines and toward these cleaner energy, climate friendly, and environmentally just practices that many of us want to see. I also know that this pandemic has unfortunately shed a light on deep and pre-existing racial disparities. And I think we have a moment right now to really consider the voices of minority and tribal communities, how they've been disproportionately impacted by harmful fossil fuel pollution, and how we can use all of this societal momentum to advance our transition to safe, clean energy, and to include our public lands in that. So I'd like to start, if I could, with a question for Ms. Prochnik. And I'm interested in the fact that we continue to hear these dismissals of clean energy. You heard it just now. You can't get there from here. You can't balance the grid. The sun doesn't always shine. The wind doesn't always blow. How do these characterizations square with the reality of our increasingly nimble, interconnected grid, the magic of me being able to turn on my light switch right over here and to actually power my home and much of the north coast of California with 100% clean energy? And then while you're answering that, could you speak to how transmission and the increasingly interconnected grid plays a role in making this magic happen?
Sure. Thank you, Representative. And it's great that you have solar on your roof, and I hope that more communities can have that benefit since there's still a lot of inequities out receiving renewable energy. But it's great in that we do have clean energy. So as you pointed out, when the wind dies down, grid operators do a fantastic job of moving power around the high voltage transmission system. They're linked over hundreds of miles in the Western Interconnect, for example, moving wind from the Rockies, hydro in the Northwest, solar in the Southwest. Back when we had the solar eclipse that was, a huge deal in our country, I stood in the control room of peak reliability and watched the operators get prepared for watching 9,000 megawatts of solar come off the grid and then watch it come back on. It is amazing. During this huge, could have been an epidemic, there was no blackout. The operators, the agencies, the states, the utilities all worked together in almost a year to prep for this. We can do this. We have the tools, we have the information. We need to include more people at the table so we can get even better decision making. But we know how to manage the grid. And as we transition, we can do this in a much more reliable way.
Now, I believe during your time at the Department of Energy, you worked on efforts to identify west-wide energy corridors and to do a little more pre-planning so that we could bring more of this clean energy online and make the grid work without some of these false choices we hear, that you have to have coal, you have to have natural gas. I'd like to ask you what worked and what didn't with that energy corridor project, and how updated corridors can help our transition away from fossil fuels.
Thank you for the question. So the clean energy economy will only be successful. It's truly inclusive of all the communities affected. It's really important that the smart from the start signing that I mentioned in my testimony of a NEPA needs to be inclusive. There were conflicting missions and goals that we, the different agencies, had to come together on, but we still missed huge areas because we didn't have all the resources at the table. And so really incorporating environmental justice principles, frontline communities, and a more diverse group to be part of the planning and inclusive is really critical.
I am out of time, but thanks so much for that answer, and thanks for this hearing, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. And now I recognize Representative Kern for your questions. Welcome.
Mr. Chairman, Republican Leader Gosar, thank you for this opportunity. Thank all the witnesses for being here today. While we may disagree totally on some of the positions that are on this call or this Zoom meeting, I certainly appreciate everyone's expertise coming to bear. I do find it interesting that some of the companies that we know as some of our greenest companies in the world. I'll use one in particular, one we all know very well, and Google has its largest data server farm in the world, literally 30 miles from my house here. And what probably many of the folks on this call that are representing California would say is probably one of the dirtiest states in the world. So it's just sort of interesting how, and it's literally sitting 1,000 yards from a natural gas plant, so they have reliable energy. But I digress. As a member, as an engineer as well, I'm not a forestry engineer as my colleague from Arkansas is, but an engineer who appreciates technology. I'm a member who has stated many times that I'm an all of the above approach to energy production. I actually spent most of my life within about 15 miles of a nuclear power plant in Arkansas. So I know the reliability you get there and the importance of how clean that energy is. And my colleague from Arkansas now represents that area. So we have a lot in common. I'm very interested in listening to what you all have to say about energy initiatives and production. But we also have to talk about costs around this. We've had these dialogues before in the hearings in past, and I think it's interesting how we talk about the sustainability, but we don't talk about the costs, the hard costs associated with what many of the minority and low-income Green Deal ideas. As we increase the world's carbon footprint by pushing production to countries with minimal regulation, as we move folks out, we're not isolated from CO2 emissions. The world is, while we may be lowering, in which we have, other parts of the world are making up for that exponentially. We need to stop making America more reliant on foreign adversaries for energy production, as we've talked about changing some of our refineries so we use more of our fossil fuels here as opposed to bringing in heavy crudes from around the world to put refined products back out around the world. All of this is applicable to a bill introduced by Chairman Grijalva in the so-called Environmental Justice for All Act, a veiled attempt to the chairman to stifle American energy production. And my colleagues will claim this bill implements necessary reporting requirements to gauge the health impacts of energy production. What they won't tell you is that the considerations are they're unnecessary, as they're already addressed in NEPA and the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and other applicable statutes. What they also won't tell you is that these assessments will not consider benefits of proposed energy infrastructure projects, including thousands of well-paying jobs, access to reliable, affordable energy for communities, and the prevention of energy poverty. The same is true in this hearing today. This is not an effort to find solutions to environmental justice. This is an attempt of Democrats to bash the fossil fuel energy production in America. And, I've got a question today for Ms. Obed. Through your work, your business generates economic opportunity for its shareholders through responsible natural resource development. Could you explain these benefits of natural resource development for tribal communities in Alaska?
Yes, Representative, thank you for the question. Doyon seeks very hard to provide benefits to our shareholders through jobs, wages, charitable contributions, donations, and scholarships for education for our future shareholders. Those are the reasons why we have strong shareholder support for a lot of the natural resource development projects that we participate in.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate everybody again being on here today to express your points of view. And it's great to hear some of the benefits of energy production. I hope that my colleagues will understand that see these benefits too. Mr. Chairman, as always, I appreciate being on here with the committee, and I'll sell you a razor when we get back.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Representative Hearn. I look forward to being back with you also. I now recognize Chairman Grijalva for 5 minutes of questions. Welcome, Chairman.
Thank you for the hearing. I appreciate it very much. And first of all, I just want to tell Ms. Rose that I wanted to congratulate her for the recent cancellation of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. And it's good to see her again. It's, I think, a success story other people across the nation need to learn from. And her leadership and the coalition that she was part of took this environmental justice issue of great significance to that community, and with persistence succeeded. And I just want to congratulate her. I think that the question I have, there's no either or here. There is some important points. Renewable alternative energy is, like it or not, it's an inevitability for the station. That's the direction we're going. And much of what we see in the decline of fossil fuel in this country, coal being the primary one, has to do with the economies of that extraction and that fuel, and the consumer preferences that are going on worldwide and certainly nationwide. And to say that the straits that those companies find themselves in is all a consequence, including the Atlantic Pipeline and the Dakota Access Pipeline, is because of the protests around those issues is disingenuous at best. Now we have all these bankruptcies going on across the country, from gas, from fracking enterprises, from extraction enterprises, and as they leave their pollution behind, and leave the bill to the American taxpayers to have to clean up after them. And I think when you look at this, it's a much more comprehensive package than a simple either or. I wanted to ask Ms. Patterson, you're probably aware that the failure to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act resulted in the Dakota Access being shut down. Along with my colleague, Representative McEachin, as the chairman indicated at the beginning of the meeting, we've introduced the Environmental Justice for All Act. It's not so-called, it's real, and all of us are going to have a chance to deal with it in the near future. And to grant more public input for major projects like oil, gas pipelines, in this instance, and begin to address the impacts of decades of environmental discrimination and racism, and to deal with cumulative effects. What's your assessment of the bill? And do you think it could have a meaningful impact going forward?
Thank you so much. I think that the bill is absolutely critical. Having the communities, as we've seen from my co-panelists, particularly Ms. Rose, that communities know the solutions that work for them, and it's really having communities on the front lines of making decisions that result in the decisions that are the real solutions versus the false solutions that we see advancing from folks who aren't of the community, making decisions for the community. So even when we think about examples like in New York, and in response to the heat waves, there was a well-meaning attempt to recognizing that cooling centers are difficult in this COVID-19 reality. There was a decision to give window units of air conditioning to communities. But because there was that dialogue, there was also feedback from the community that would be great, but we're already suffering from energy burden. And so combined with giving the air conditioning, they also provided relief for bills. So those are the kinds of integrated policy making that only results from having community input. Thank you.
And I think, Ms. Hilton, let me ask you the same question essentially that Ms. Patterson just dealt with about your assessment of the Environmental Justice for All Act. Have you had that opportunity?
Thank you, Representative. Thank you, Chairman. I think the clean energy economy, and I agree with Jackie Patterson, because it really is about inclusivity. Clean energy economy will only be successful if it's truly inclusive of all the economies affected. For so long, energy production and delivery has focused on depleting the resources from frontline communities or burdening them with health hazards. For example, the Navajo Nation provided land, water, coal, labor, and did not receive electricity produced from land. Some utilities today are starting to right the wrong, but to be more good stewards, we need to demonstrate how the industry is different and how environmental justice principles and communities' voices must be included.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, again, thank you. And This is a very important hearing. I appreciate the witnesses and our colleagues that have shown up, and thank you a lot. Appreciate it. I yield back.
Thank you. And I'm going to recognize myself now for the final 5 minutes of questions. And I'm going to preface my statements, but because we are talking about environmental justice, and I want to share with you what happened the other night at a community meeting online, which was held by having my neighborhood be responsive. Listen to the Long Beach is very fortunate where I live to have our own health department, and our director of the health department was there. And the first thing, well, one of the early things that she said was, on the west side of Long Beach, which is primarily an industrial complex with a lot of stable neighborhoods, primarily neighborhoods, people of color, first generation into our community. It's the home of the Port of Long Beach, lots of the warehouses, distribution on the west side of Long Beach is a little over than 69 years. And then she said, where you're talking about on the east side of Long Beach, the life expectancy of a new child is 86 years. That means just a few miles away from me, a child already starts with should be the same beginning of a life expectancy difference of 17 years. That's unconscionable. I have not been able to get that out of my mind for the last week or so. It brings it home to me. We have this responsibility to ensure, as we do new development, new energy, that we make sure that we do not repeat some of the mistakes of the past and make it such that it impacts. Not saying that people do it deliberately or not. I do know that, Ms. Patterson, that you have another appointment and you need to depart in 1 minute from this hearing. I just want to ask you one quick question. We're talking about reducing pollution, helping environmental justice communities, primarily lower income minority communities. Can we do that, Congress, through voluntary actions, or do we really need to have state and federal government engage in more regulatory action? I'd like to hear your opinion quickly.
Thank you. Yes, we absolutely need to have mandatory action. Our advocacy has been around renewable portfolio standards that are mandatory, energy efficiency resource standards that are mandatory. Recognizing that with having that without having that kind of compelling legislation, that we won't make the aggressive shifts that we need to make to take the toxic pollution out of these communities and shift us to a new energy economy that provides the energy that we need while protecting the health and well-being of communities that are currently in harm's way.
Thank you, and you may leave the meeting. I know you have
Thank you. Thank you.
You have to leave at 11. Bye now.
Thank you.
Okay, I'd now like to turn to Ms. Rose. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for your long-term commitment and activism as a volunteer, someone in your community who, as you say, you moved to this community to retire, and look what happened. You became a community activist, and I want to know what was the pressure? We have heard for years about the needs to rush the Atlantic Coast Pipeline because we have a dire need for more natural gas. And as a local resident, did you feel that pressure, that there was some sort of rush to get this pipeline approved, and it would be better for you just to get out of the way because of this?
Thank you for the question. Dominion Energy always told us through their mailing, through their informational meeting, TV ads, and even the few meetings they had at Union Hill after we raised the public awareness here that the gas was needed, would bring jobs and would be inevitable. It was as if the pipes were already in the ground. Some people believe this, and so they did not feel they could resist it.
Thank you for, for that. So you did feel the pressure.
Yes.
We're really at the end. I have many more questions, but I will submit them in writing. I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank all the witnesses. I have found this to be an extremely productive hearing. I think that, and I like the attitude between all of us, even when there were disagreements, that we dealt with this in a very positive, congenial manner. And so with that, I want to say that there's no further business.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
Mr. Chairman, I have some items to submit for the record.
without objection, Mr.
Okay,
West.
to start with, some articles that highlight that access to natural gas continues to be a challenge for some minority communities because there's not yet pipeline infrastructure connecting those communities to natural gas. The first article is a Chicago Tribune article dated December 2019, titled Residents of Impoverished Pembroke Township Live Without Natural Gas Heat. Now Jesse Jackson is joining the push to bring a pipeline to the community. The second article is an Axios article entitled Inside Reverend Jesse Jackson's Push for Natural Gas Pipeline from May of 2020. I'd also like to submit for the record a lawsuit filed by a group called the 200 that I think my California colleagues will recognize that group. I believe it's led by a Democratic California Assemblyman. It's a organization that works on affordable housing issues, and the lawsuit is against the California Air Resources Board. In 2018, the suit argued that California's climate policies, including a net zero requirement for all housing projects for construction for operation, were hurting the ability of low-income Californians to obtain affordable housing and driving up the cost of transportation. Also have some charts here from the U.S. Energy Information Administration. May be hard to read, but this little green slice shows that of all energy consumption, a whopping 11% of that was from renewables. And, I'm a huge fan of renewables, especially biofuels. And 43% of that 11% came from biomass. And then I also have this additional chart that shows an electrical generation. Of all electrical generation, there was less than 10% that came from solar and wind. And finally, without objection, I would like to submit a documentary by an icon of the left, Michael Moore, called The Planet of the Humans, that delves into the fallacy behind reducing all carbon emissions by going to things like electric vehicles.
Without objection, they will be, so they are now submitted into the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Again, the members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you as the witnesses to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit their witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there's no further business, without objection, this committee stands adjourned.